Welcome to the podcast for Healing Neurology, where we talk about everything that can help heal your neurology, which is really everything from food, lifestyle, and medicine to nature, culture, and politics. There's no topic too big or too small. I'm Jillian Ehrlich, family nurse practitioner, certified in Ayurveda and functional medicine. And I am thrilled with our guest today. Riana Giusti is a certified nutritionist at Starkle Nutrition. She's got a bit of a long introduction, but I want you all to know how amazing this gal is. So, believing in the power of food as medicine, Riana Giusti is a functional medicine nutritionist who holds a master's degree in whole foods nutrition and research from Bastyr University. Before returning to private practice with Starkle Nutrition, she directed a brain-based focused nutrition teaching kitchen while cooking with and counseling families to treat a variety of cognitive and neurological disorders, including Alzheimer's, dementia, and cognitive impairment. Riana also worked as a health coach for a Seattle-based wellness company, honing her skills in integrating and translating comprehensive blood, genetic, hormone, and gut microbiome data to generate evidence-based and personalized plans for her patients, focusing on all aspects of preventative health, including digestion, healthy aging, sleep, and stress management, in addition to nutrition and physical activity. She has worked as a culinary nutrition instructor, personal chef, and in professional kitchens throughout Seattle. She also manages the Metabolic Reset program at Starkle Nutrition, which you can find more about at metreset.com, metreset.com, which is a lifestyle-focused and compassionate approach to weight loss, known as a relief from chronic dieting. Riana is also a certified intuitive eating counselor, is a member of the American Nutrition Association, as well as the Center for Mindful Eating. Her next endeavor is a board certification in specialized ketogenic diets as a therapeutic approach for cancer care, neurologic disorders, and insulin resistance. And yes, she did write her master's thesis on chocolate, including the mineral content, flavonoids, and the science behind food labels, which we will get to later. With the goal of achieving optimal health, Riana seeks to motivate and empower her clients to not only lead a self-fulfilling, healthy lifestyle, but also achieve a relationship with their bodies and food that is nourishing, flexible, peaceful, sustainable, and balanced. Riana, welcome.
Thank you so much. This is so exciting to be here, Jillian.
So I first want to know, how do you eat? Like you personally, how do you decide?
Yeah, sometimes information can be a huge burden. And, I think, the more you know, the more you start overanalyzing everything. And honestly, when I step into the kitchen, notice a lot of my background comes more from intuitive eating, mindful eating, that piece. So it's always a balance, right? It's a beautiful partnership of taking into account the nutrition side and the amazing scientific and medical properties of food. And also thinking about, listening to my body in terms of what sounds good, what am I in the mood for, what sounds really nourishing in that moment, because it's going to be different from day to day. So I can't just go by a prescriptive scientific approach always. I need to really be in the moment as well and take into account, my love for certain foods. So sometimes that might be, a salad and some lean protein. Other times that's going to look completely different. I eat carbs. I enjoy sugar from time to time, knowing all the science behind that. So I think it's always all about balance. You cannot get too caught up in the details. Otherwise you'll be paralyzed.
And when did you know that, how did you get interested in nutrition?
Oh, great question. So yeah, I have been on the nutrition train for as long as I can remember. So probably, I grew up always cooking and loving food in the kitchen. I come from a Spanish-Italian family, so food is a huge part of our culture and celebrations, as it is most. And, I think it was around middle school where I read an article about ketogenic diets, actually, and their ability to manage epilepsy and other neurological conditions in children. I was just floored. I'd never really thought about food as medicine before then. And I didn't grow up in a medical or really science-oriented family, so I wasn't exposed to, functional medicine wasn't what it is today. Back then, this was 25 years ago. So yeah, it's a lot has changed. So I think just seeing that article as an adolescent just opened my eyes to a whole other side of food. And also this amazing opportunity to kind of partner both of my two passions. So really, or rather two applications of food, the enjoyment, the expression of care and love and community, and also this amazing power and healing aspect to it.
And you initially went into school gardens. Was that your first foray into food?
Yes and no. In high school, I completed a regional occupation program for culinary with all the full intention of then going on to an advanced culinary school. But I actually got my degree in clinical nutrition and dietetics at UC Davis. And so from even undergrad, I was very much on the hardcore nutrition, I suppose you could call it. Really getting into the biochemistry side of it. I actually worked in research for a while. And it wasn't until being so kind of pigeonholed and isolated in research and really isolated away from that human connection piece and all the wonderful things that food can do, that I sort of swung in polar opposite. And that's really when I then moved out to a farm in California. I lived outside for a while. And then working in school gardens was kind of my way back into civilization, I guess you could call it. So it was a way that of sharing my kind of newfound passion there with farming and gardening. With the next generation of eaters and game changers there. So yeah, I worked in the public school system for a little over, about a year and a half, almost 2 years maybe. This was in the Bay Area of California. So it was through a USDA grant. So we worked with Title I schools. So a majority of those kids were well below the poverty line there. And yeah, we worked on building school gardens in urban areas and maintaining them, and really just educating around, what it's like to grow your own food and also then cook with that food. So we did a lot of cooking demonstrations in the classes as well. And so this was as young as kindergartners all the way up into high school.
Can you share with us some of the challenges and successes from that program? I mean, I'm curious, it seems, how hard is it to get a school to grow a garden? How do you cook in a kitchen, like in a high school classroom?
The program not only was involved in, maintaining existing school gardens if the school was, fortunate enough to already have one. And also, we worked with schools that, never had really had a garden. And so it really became working with the superintendent, working with the county, working with all of the staff on site to really get them on board. Because part of it was also, we needed classroom time too, to talk about it and to bring the kids out to the garden and get their exposure out there. So, there were so many pit holes, whether it be working with a principal who's 100% on board, funding and time is tight. I understood it at the time. And it was sort of me alone at a school for this really great cause. Yeah. And so I usually had a couple teachers on board that then I could kind of help spread the word out. But, whether it's working within the politics within a school system, working within a politics between teachers and things like that, of getting them all on board. Because, at that time, especially more so than even less so than now, teachers were really forced to teach specifics to an exam and things like that. So all of their classroom time was so precious. So even just sort of getting that mindset change of that, bringing kids out to the garden, was still supportive and helpful and beneficial. So another aspect of my job during that time was doing research studies proving that, schools with school gardens had lower incidences of behavioral incidences, less violence, just better concentration, and we're getting some of the other metrics we looked at that time. Well, and even just better dietary intake. So, then when they went on to the cafeteria, making healthier selections in that sense. So tending to see more junk food intake go down as well, which was really exciting. So, always trying to bolster our message on that side, showing that we are research backed, but, always dealing with a little bit of pushback on the other side. So even we then started designing curriculum that then fit with the standards. That way it's not actually taking any time away. So it was constantly just adapting and responding of just how, can we earn our keep here? Some other challenges, given that we were in such urban areas, there oftentimes was a lot of vandalism, that can happen, whether it was damage to fruit trees that we'd put in or theft of fruit and produce that we were growing, would have been some of the minor things. But oftentimes, these gardens did have to be gated and locked, which just broke my heart, having them not be accessible to everyone at all times. But we just had to do our best. So funding, I think, and getting volunteers excited was some of the biggest challenges, but also some of the most rewarding, when the community did show up. So those were some of the biggest things we dealt with. But it was just really exciting to work with kids who might have not ever had exposure to this, and also maybe had never left the Bay Area. So just never having really understood that California as a whole is a giant agricultural state. And, my parents both grew up there, and, my dad literally wouldn't get to start school until harvest was done. So, it's a completely different reality for them. And actually the first school I worked at was actually where my grandmother went to school, there in San Leandro. So that was just really special for me to kind of come full loop and be supporting that community that obviously is so different from a time when she worked there too.
And what were some of the reactions of the students, like between kindergartners and, seniors in high school? What were some reactions?
Yeah. A big part of, my time there was really instilling this kind of scientist experiment mind, I like to call it, because obviously broccoli is not every student's and kids' favorite food, whether they're in kindergarten or high school. Yeah. Opinions vary. So I'm always, utilizing that as a way to, you just have to try one bite, you have to try it all. You don't have to eat it all rather, but just give it a chance. And even just expressing polite ways of, expressing, that it's not my favorite, or, I tried it, but, I'm okay now in that sense. So that was really, really fun to see, even just like developing a little bit of etiquette and social behaviors and things like that around how to express your dislike for something politely. But also it was really impressive that how excited kids were to try, the fruits and vegetables that they had really worked on themselves, that they had seen, that they had planted from a tiny seed that was unrecognizable to them. And then kind of seeing that come full circle and mature. So, I got to a point in that job where kids would ask me, like, how come the fruits and vegetables in the cafeteria don't look like what we're eating out here? Oftentimes when they had them in the cafeteria, they weren't in their whole food form. They would have been, chopped up or processed or had a lot of other things added to them that, they weren't as recognizable to the kids. And oh my gosh, that question just stunned me. I think I responded with, that's a really good question. And that's about all I could tell him at that point, because I was very limited, in the power that I had over the school lunch program and the huge amount of subsidies and resources that go into that. That was just an area that I really couldn't touch, given my role. I was employed by the county, not technically a school employee. So I was a specialist coming in. So that's when I went back to grad school.
Is that around the time that ketchup was reclassified as a vegetable?
Yeah, also with potatoes as well. So then French fries, they wanted to be classified as a vegetable as well. So for days, like pizza day, for example, the tomato sauce on the pizza could be considered a vegetable, just the same as ketchup with the fries and things like that. So just all these little loopholes of just ways to try and classify something to hit the dietary standards of the time.
One thing we firmly believe at Center for Healing Neurology and beyond is that how we eat and how we digest really helps build our brains from infancy, from in utero even, all the way through our last breath. So if we're eating, and Ayurveda says that we eat so that food transforms first into tissue, then into heat, then into immunity and tolerance, and then into consciousness. So we really want to eat for the consciousness that we seek. Knowing that we want to be conscious and with our minds intact to the very best of our ability until our last breath, starting with school gardens, starting with thinking about feeding children, what are the types of diets that can best feed our brains?
Well, and I'm so glad you brought up the digestion piece. Because that is such a key element. You and I are going to talk about a lot of different eating styles and ways to approach eating, but none of that really matters if the digestion isn't in a place to be able to accept that food, to be able to absorb it, assimilate, transform it, and assimilate it. You could be eating the quote unquote best diet in the world and just not getting the full benefit of that, as you well know. So there's so many dietary options out there when it comes to cognitive health and brain health. And there's no one right diet for anyone. I follow that philosophy across all areas of my practice. So whether it's someone who's seeking weight loss or blood sugar management or managing inflammation, or has a full-blown diagnosis like Alzheimer's on the dementia spectrum, the approach is going to be so unique and individualized for that person. A lot of the goals, when it comes to cognitive health are very similar. Most of the dietary approaches are going to really focus on that overarching goal of reducing inflammation, since typically that's a hallmark and a commonality we see across most neurological disorders and most disease states. That's generally a recognized practice that all of them come from some state of inflammation, whether it's chronic or acute. So, it could range in severity and in focus, as far as what we're going to use for the individual. But, it's always going to be dependent on, exactly what they have going on. And also just taking into account them as a whole person. So their lifestyle, their experiences, their preferences, of course, I can't emphasize that enough. Again, I can explain why something is supportive and how something is supportive and, quote unquote, prescribe this to my patient. But if it's just not in line with, their personal belief system and their preferences and their cultural choices and things like that, it's not going to be consistent or realistic for them. And when it comes to things like treating cognitive health, 2 weeks of following a dietary protocol is not really going to have those results. And really that applies to anyone I'm helping and treating. So it's really about something that patient can show up to consistently and sustainably. and is also still, and not going to cause harm to their relationship with food. I never want to cause more fear in someone's life when it comes to food. So always making sure that we're making recommendations that are going to fit into that person's lifestyle realistically and compassionately, of just taking into account, that they're living a life. And yes, their number one goal in that moment might be to treat their disease, but we still have a lot of other conditions on the table too to think about. So, I mean, as far as like what are the options for treating, it could be something as simple as more of just a general anti-inflammatory diet. So maybe something very similar to the Mediterranean type diet. We look at different aspects of maybe intermittent fasting, depending on what that person has going on. So the intermittent fasting, there's two prongs of that might feed into cognitive health specifically. So one is just your aspect of caloric restriction, that really can help manage inflammation on its own, as well as helping to manage blood sugar and that insulin response too. So that tends to be a hallmark of what we see as one of the root causes of sometimes that inflammation. So mismanaged blood sugars, and also just so that fuel in the brain is also, sometimes those don't always match. So someone can have perfectly normal blood sugar numbers and response and things like that, but that insulin response then in the brain and how that's translating to cross the blood-brain barrier isn't always in tune, if that makes sense. Such that you're looking at, how consistently is fuel getting to the brain? Because, if that brain is not getting proper fuel, consistent fuel source and consistent oxygen, that's really going to impact function for the negative there.
Can you talk a little bit more about how a blood sugar can seem stable? Like if we throw a continuous glucose monitor on a person, how or why might it be different in their brain?
So, a continuous glucose monitor is really looking at that in general circulation, in your body. And so it's really very responsive to, what you're taking in and your own unique then glucose response and pattern. So that rise and that fall. It's such a helpful tool, I would definitely say, depending on someone's goals. It can be such an eye opener of seeing your exact response to certain foods, because it's not classic always. I think it's surprising for some people when they get the opportunity to wear one of these monitors to see that, they respond very differently to a food than they might have thought they would, whether it's to wine, whether it's to a very carb heavy, sugar heavy item, whether it's something where the fats vary, that can really influence it for someone based on their genetics. That by far and large is such an eye-opening experience. But yes, as we were saying, it doesn't necessarily always translate directly to what's happening in the brain. So that's definitely where, someone who's on the trajectory of Alzheimer's disease or some type of cognitive decline, likely they're going to have MRIs that go along with that, such that we can see, where there's inflammation, where there's atrophy. So the atrophy really is letting us know that, fuel and oxygen are not getting to this area of the brain. We tend to see that those parts of the brain dying off or decreasing in activity. And so that really is a sign that, the brain isn't getting proper nutrition and proper fuel. So both have to go hand in hand. So definitely if the blood sugars aren't managed in the body, that's a key sign that something's also going on in the brain. But oftentimes we just need to dive a little bit deeper. So looking more so at that insulin response can be a really helpful number, something that even in a lot of diabetes management and blood sugar management practices is not something that's as routinely measured. We tend to look at just hemoglobin A1C and we tend to look at fasting blood sugar, but that doesn't tell the whole story. That doesn't tell you what's going on, the 23 other hours of that person's day, because it's just a snapshot, right?
Yep. Yep.
It's something that's changing all the time throughout the day. And so making sure that, and obviously, yes, part of that is my job too, of making sure they're fueling themselves with foods that are known to sort of help support a managed response in that way. And also just helping them take in foods that can really cross the blood-brain barrier and really heal what's going on up there in the brain.
What are some of those foods?
Most of the foods, that are really, if we think about what our brain is made of, majority of the brain is composed of fats. So really thinking about the quality of fats we're taking in is going to be one of the most supportive aspects we can do when we're trying to heal any type of neurological issue. So we're thinking about the health of all of our cellular membranes. That's really going to help fuel transfer as well as neurotransmitter transfer, any sort of cellular signaling that has to go on. That's the membranes interacting. So, if those membranes are too rigid, the proper nutrients can't get in and out. If they're too fluid or too open, that's letting improper things flow in and out. So really having the right balance of the types of fats we're taking in to really guarantee that we have healthy cellular membranes that can communicate really, really well with each other. Because what we're taking in is literally composing our cells in our brain. So that's hence the old adage, you are what you eat. But I would like to add to that you are what you absorb.
Yes.
So the types of healthy fats, ketogenic diets are something that are brought up a lot in the conversation with primarily for weight loss nowadays, but in my field, more so treating neurological disorders, because as most of your listeners know, they tend to be very high in fat, those types of diet. And so in my experience, it's really shifting the balance towards more anti-inflammatory fats. So focusing on more of those omega-3 rich foods. Those would be things like the low mercury fish. I designate that with the acronym SMASH. So S for salmon, M for mackerel, A for anchovies, S for sardines, and H for herring. So really those smaller non-predatory fish where mercury just can't accumulate quite as readily. Those are going to be a wealth of anti-inflammatory fatty acids, as well as other mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids. So things like avocados, nuts and seeds, extra virgin olive oil, are going to be some of the biggest hallmarks there. And so something to really think about, given that all of those fats that we consume are literally going to be composing our cellular membranes, quality is really, really key. So a lot of the pesticides are fat soluble. So, really trying to prioritize organic when you can, especially for the fats, just because it's really hard to extract those out, or rather for our body to extract those out when we consume them.
And what are your thoughts about if we make recommendations for patients, like say for extra omega-3s, as in fish oil, but a person is vegetarian or vegan, what are your recommendations for them?
Right. Because, with most of those vegan and vegetarian or other not, plant-based sources, they also tend to be packaged with a lot of fiber. So that definitely does determine a limit as far as how many we can take in. They're very filling. Too much of that can have a gastrointestinal effect. That's a great question. And so, the plant forms are, I think of those as more of precursor to omega-3s. They're the building blocks of omega-3. So our body has to sort of reorganize those in order to then, manufacture those into omega-3s. And that is a process that is not efficient in most people. It tends to become less efficient as we age. And also based on genetics, just how efficient we are in making that conversion. So it's definitely a huge consideration. That may be a place where a supplement could be a little bit better utilized there. That way, it's literally just the pure building blocks there that could be derived from vegetarian sources. Again, they're not as concentrated. And for some people's genetics, like I've worked with vegetarians where we've tried to get their omega-3 indexes up, and maybe they're also managing elevated cholesterol too, or some other reason where we really would want to focus on those omega-3s. And it can be really difficult, really, really challenging to get up those omega-3s. So, I always want to respect, the dietary choices. And I've had plenty of vegans and vegetarians on a keto type plan. It is possible. It just takes a lot more planning, a lot more support, a lot more organization. But I wouldn't say it's impossible by any means. You just have to be a lot more vigilant, monitor it a lot more closely, and just be very, very organized and thoughtful in terms of how you plan your meals.
Do you use algae-based omega-3s?
Yeah, so the algae-based would be one of the omega-3s I would recommend to those who would prefer to abstain from all animal products. That would be the option there. And again, as I mentioned, it is not as concentrated. And depending on someone's genetics, it might not be overturned quite as efficiently. But for some individuals, it can really meet their needs quite nicely.
What are the genetics that don't process well for that?
So it's really the turnover of really constructing those omega-3s. So for some people, they might be more inclined to produce more omega-6s rather than omega-3s, so more pro-inflammatory types of fatty acids rather than the anti-inflammatory. So if, that really determines the rate and the efficiency of how quickly that turnover is going to happen. And then also once that turnover happens, of kind of which direction in the pathway it's likely to get shunted. So that's really the biggest determinant. And so, that can be determined through a simple SNP test, looking at that. And there's more than one. So it's really not just isolating one SNP. There's many SNPs that are involved kind of in this, aspect of metabolism and looking at which way it's going to go. So that's something I always like to bring up. I think genetics is such a hot topic these days. And I've worked a lot in the field of looking at different ways of analyzing the genome. My biggest takeaway is just that, there's so little power in just looking at one isolated SNP. We need to take into account how all of these genes work together to really impact phenotypes or how we see them presenting, in our lives.
just for a minute on
Mhm.
intermittent fasting. When you were talking about that, you were mentioning decreased caloric intake. And
Mhm.
I have looked at some of the studies that show that reducing caloric intake is one of the things that can reduce all-cause mortality and extend
Mhm.
longevity. So if we just
Yeah.
eat less, obviously
Yeah.
that's not for all of us, but
No.
what we know is that for most Americans, we're overfed and undernourished. So if we reduce our caloric intake, does it make a difference if it's concentrated in a number of hours in the day, or if we eat still every 4 hours ish, but reduce the amount that we eat every four
Mhm.
hours?
Yeah, great. That's a great distinction. And so I think before diving too deep into this subject, I do want to remind your listeners that the majority of the studies on intermittent fasting have still been done in mice, where it's harder to determine how cranky and their quality life is.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
We're really just looking at the numbers there. So it's really hard to get all that fun qualitative data that has a huge impact when we're working with humans. So I just want to put that into that frame there. That yes, we do know that taking in less fuel is a huge predictor, and that all-cause mortality tends to be correlated with a decreased risk of all-cause mortality. So the difference between, having, I think you mentioned eating between a very narrow window of time. So maybe for 8 hours, and that can be a more extreme version of that. Or for most people, and this depends on genetics as well. So when we're working with dementia patients or cognitive decline patients, looking at their ApoE4 status can really be a big predictor of maybe how long they need to fast. So we know that tends to be loosely associated with an increased. I say loosely just because I've worked with so many individuals that are afflicted with this that do not have the gene, and vice versa. So I always want to stress that your genes are not your destiny. And that ApoE4 gene does tend to be correlated with higher risks of heart disease as well. And then also higher incidences, because it's correlated with that increased risk of Alzheimer's, we tend to see higher presentation of those beta amyloid plaques and taus, which again, I should say, just because those are present doesn't mean that someone's symptomatic. There's been plenty of postmortem studies looking at brains where about everyone tends to have them, but only 50% typically are symptomatic.
Mm-hmm.
So another huge caveat to take into place. So just sort of setting the stage of sort of why we're doing all these things, but also taking into account that major caveat that we need to remember that, these don't, because we're trying to decrease the formation of the beta amyloid plaques and the taus, just because they're there doesn't mean that the person has Alzheimer's. It really just, when we start being symptomatic and it starts impacting function, that's when we really need to do something about it. So, and it also doesn't address why they're there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just taking them away isn't going to fix the root cause of the problem either. So all of that to say, in a very roundabout way, determining what type of intermittent fasting protocol someone should be on, we're going to look at a couple different factors. So we're going to look at their ApoE status. Someone who has more markers of the ApoE4 gene, I would want them to fast longer versus someone who has no copies. A prolonged nighttime fast, meaning that 12 hours overnight. So having your last meal of the evening, maybe you finish eating by 7:30. Your first meal isn't going to be until 7:30 the next day. That right there can have huge impacts on someone's blood sugar, their insulin resistance, as well as kickstarting the autophagy mechanism in the brain. So that's the cleanup mechanism. It's a natural mechanism our brain tends to go into in the nighttime if conditions are ideal. If you're digesting a huge meal before you go to bed, you're going to have much less autophagy. If your blood sugar is really high as you're going to bed, much less autophagy. If you're in a really stressed state or not getting quality sleep, again, we're not going to see as much of that autophagy. So it depends on a lot of factors. But again, just that 12-hour fast can be really meaningful for a lot of people and correct. And so a longer duration would be more that 16 hours. 14 or 16 would kind of be the next durations I would go with people. Unless a patient is coming to me really, really excited about the intermittent fasting, I don't tend to go there to the extremes, just because I don't find it as realistic for most people, especially for the long term. It might be something we would use intermittently on and off to sort of jumpstart some of those processes in the body that I talked about, like the autophagy, and really looking to see, can we normalize that insulin response? Can we get some of those inflammatory markers to go down? Are some of their cardiovascular disease risk markers going down? Just to make sure that things are headed in the right trajectory for this individual. And also making sure that it's not disrupting, their life too much. These fasting protocols can be very isolating. They don't tend to work very well with our normal feeding structure and our cultural practices around food. So always wanting to take that into account as well, of just making sure that we're not isolating this person anymore. Because oftentimes the folks I work with, with cognitive decline and any type of issues with dementia, they're already so isolated.
Yeah.
They're feeling very isolated and withdrawn from the community. They're less confident to show up and go out and do things with people, to speak their mind, to share, interact with people. So the last thing I want to do is further isolate them further. So all these considerations need to be taken into account when trying to determine whether or not intermittent fasting is going to be right for that person. And then to contrast that with your question around eating every 4 hours, for someone who maybe is having a significant cortisol response from, mismanaged blood sugars, that could be another approach. So it really depends on what we're feeding them every 4 hours to see what's going to work best for that person. I mean, everyone is an N of one, right? We have all these beautiful recommendations and the trajectory of where science is going, but really, working with a practitioner who is going to be willing to try things and experiment, and you yourself as a patient keeping an open mind is just so key, because these are still really new fields in the field of medicine and health, and nutrition itself is such a young science. We are learning so much week by week, day by day, as far as, the best ways to help someone heal. So I think, finding what works best for that individual is key. So yeah, always keeping an open mind and willing to try kind of the next thing in the toolkit to see what's going to move the needle in the right direction for that person. So yeah, as with the every 4 hour eating, again, that can be really helpful at balancing blood sugar, balancing hormones and things like that for some people. For other people, it might not be as supportive. So, really just working with your unique metabolism in that sense to find what's best. Yeah. Because some people, when they're fasting, it is not a good fit. They feel terrible. They feel sad. They feel fatigue. And it's not just for that initial, couple of days they do it. It's like no matter how long they've kind of been going in and out of the protocols and the cycling, they just feel awful. So it's definitely not a great protocol, an ideal protocol for everyone, despite, a lot of the great scientific gains, we're seeing from it in the research.
I use a lot of Ayurveda in my practice, as you know, and we kind of gear fasting towards the constitutional type. So a Vata predominant constitution is going to be a thin, dry, light, kind of windy-minded person, a person who can make connections well that others don't in their mind, a person who learns quickly and forgets quickly. And that's not a great person they're kind of like the hummingbird. And so the recommendation...
they need all that fuel.
It would be more routine eating, maybe even smaller meals, because even while they're starting to chew, their mind is somewhere else. They're thinking about something else. And a kapha person would be more associated with, and this is not, this is by no means rote, but in terms of constitutional types, a kapha person is a person who can withstand a longer period of not eating and metabolize more slowly in general, so that you would want them to have greater periods of kind of without influence, so that their body can do that internal work. And a pitta person needs to eat regularly or they get hangry. Talk about intermittent fasting. Any thoughts about, or any of the science or research behind whether, if you're only eating within an 8-hour window, whether it's better that 8-hour window of eating between, say, 11 a.m. and 7 p.m. versus 8 a.m. and 4 p.m.?
Yeah, so they think there's pros and cons to both. I mean, I honestly, again, that would be just where we would work closely with that patient to see what's going to fit best into their lifestyle. For instance, like if they are someone who tends to love doing really hard workouts early in the morning, and they're showing up to their workouts so depleted and just so in a fuel deficient state, even though they may be going into ketosis at that time and using some of those ketone bodies, maybe their workout's really intense. It's a higher intensity, more so than the ketosis can keep up with and really supply them adequate energy for. It really just depends on like how adapted that person's metabolism is. Again, the way their social schedule is set up and things like that, and how what really works best for them. Because everyone's metabolism is different. Some people feel much more active and alert and awake and are ready to go in the mornings. And others, as we know, are definitely not. They don't feel their best until later in the day. So part of it, you might want to call it based on your own circadian rhythm, your chronotype even, whether there's quote unquote science behind that or not, we know it plays out in our patients. We just see that some people just don't thrive as well. And they're also not getting the gains, from it in the blood work. They're just not making the improvements there. So that might be, that could be another variable we switch up of like where that fasting's happening. So for most of my patients, they do find it easier to miss that morning meal, but the majority of them aren't, high level athletes in that sense. Yes, they're working out really hard for them and pushing the needle. But I would say the majority of people do prefer, and maybe it's just social setup, the way their schedule is, do prefer eating less earlier in the day and really focusing their efforts there. But again, for someone's insulin response, it could be beneficial to have it flip-flop. So it really just depends. It's always my unsatisfying answer. It's the most unsatisfying but true answer in nutrition.
Yes.
There are no quick black and white easy answers. I wish there were.
Do you know if there's more autophagy if you stop eating earlier in the evening? Like if your brain has had more time without?
That's a good question. I'm not sure there've been a significant enough, number of research studies really looking at the optimal timing, that caloric restriction and that fasting protocol. There have been minimal studies looking at even protein deprivation, so lower intakes of protein along with the fasting protocol. So the research suggests that it's sort of like a healthy stressor. Of course, because of the population I tend to work with and the population that these neurological disorders tend to afflict, that's very precarious, to try and reduce their protein down even more, given that we know that those above 60, 65 tend to have actually higher needs of protein than we initially thought. So, their needs could be as high as, 1.3, 1.6 grams per kilogram. And the typical nutrition calculation is 0.8 to 0.1. And that's really just to meet bare minimum needs. And these are already a population where wound healing may be decreased. They may have undergone recent surgeries or injuries and things like that from a fall or a fracture. So all of these considerations we want to take into account, that even though the science is saying it's really, really promising to look there, putting their bodies under more stress just isn't realistic in that regard. But there's some newer research looking at it, but I don't think I'm really in a place to be able to try and apply that to a lot of the patient and age group I work with. Yeah, it's just not well indicated for that population. Because again, caloric restriction, a lot of people nowadays want to use it for weight loss too. And this population, and same with ketogenic diets, they're really popular in the weight loss circles. And that's never a goal really with the populations I work with. Very rarely, is someone actively trying to lose weight and manage their neurological disorder.
In my experience, I feel like it's easier to skip breakfast because that's when my mind feels more fresh. And I find that the emotional eating that I do towards the end of the day is unstoppable.
And I wonder, our culture is set up to, most of us tend to be more active earlier in the day. And, we tend to be gearing our next activity in the evening time as we're gearing up for sleep. So, where we don't I think it's an oversight just to say that we're not as engaged in the evening time. I think there's just different stimuli, there's different stressors, there's different factors that are happening for us in the evening times. That is one negative aspect that I do find, that when patients aren't getting adequate fuel throughout the day, we tend to see more emotional eating, more even binge-like behaviors in the evening time, because the body's literally in a starved state. So we want to balance all those factors. If someone is doing everything quote unquote perfectly during the day, but then in the evening time engage in a lot of behaviors that just aren't in line with their other goals, or maybe are even causing more harm in that regard, that's definitely another sign that, this protocol is not serving its purpose. This is not a great fit for you.
Let's dive into the ketogenic diet a little bit. What is the board certification in ketosis or ketogenic diet? What is that?
Yeah. So it's not for weight loss. First and foremost, I want to stress it's not as it applies to weight loss. So really just looking at how it applies to specific neurological conditions and brain health, as well as for metabolic disorders like insulin resistance, as well as even cancer care. That's an area that I have probably less experience in than others. I've worked with a couple of different protocols. They tended to be higher in protein. This is very, very high in protein, very, very low in carbohydrates, and more kind of middle of the road with fat. So thought processes of really denying those cancerous cells specific types of fuel and things like that. So some experience, and that was more so when I was cooking for an individual, utilizing those specific ratios and things like that. But yeah, this board certification is more so looking at, being able to apply this in a therapeutic diet way, because the goals are very different when you're applying it towards a disease state versus just trying to lose weight. And that means that also the macronutrients might be a little bit different. One would also be medically supervised. The other, is more of a fad diet and and is not medically supervised usually. So, the specifics are going to be very different in terms of kind of the ideal ratios you're looking at. So of macronutrients and things like that. And then also just the overall balance of micronutrients and overall nutrition is going to be very different, because you're going to need to meet the constraints of each of those different disease states very differently. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about ratios of macronutrients, kind of like in a standard American diet, an anti-inflammatory healthy diet, in the various versions of ketogenic diet?
One of the most common macronutrient distributions that we tend to see in kind of that hallmark ketogenic profile, very low carbohydrate. So that's usually somewhere between 5 and 10% for someone, depending on their size and their activity level, and just their metabolism, how dependent their body really is on carbs for fuel. Protein would be more moderate. So a lot of people don't realize that, protein can be, the proteins we take in can be converted to glucose. They do have an insulin response too. So wanting to make sure we're not going too high or too low in that to kind of find that sweet spot. So for most people, that could be anywhere between 15 to 25%, depending on the individual and again, their developmental needs. And then the rest would be fat. So for most people, the fat is going to be up in the 75% range, 60 to 75% for most people. So depending on kind of where those other macronutrients fall. And so for my purposes, I'm not recommending that my clients eat bacon and butter. Again, as I mentioned, I'm really trying to emphasize those anti-inflammatory fats because the ketogenic diet can be very pro-inflammatory depending on how you're doing it. So wanting to make sure you're really including the right kinds of foods within those constraints. Because as we know from school lunch programs, you can meet all those macronutrients. Yeah, you could have a perfectly balanced, constructed cookie that meets all those macronutrient requirements, or, you could utilize a lot of different whole foods and so many other goals at the same time.
If you were taking, just on average, because I think this is what's mostly used, like a 70 kilogram man, so like 150 pound, like what would the grams breakdown be, just so that we have a sense of like how many grams of fat is that a day, or how many grams of protein, or how many grams of carbs?
So that could be as high as, right around the 200 range in terms of grams of fats for some large males. I mean, I would figure somewhere in the 180 to 200 range for that person. And again, it's tough because, we're not counting calories per se on the ketogenic plan, especially for the clientele I work with, because we're oftentimes trying to prevent weight loss. Typically, people are eating many more calories on the ketogenic style plan than they would be eating more of a Western dietary plan in that regard. So yeah, it can be quite a lot. So that's where smoothies can be really helpful, just places where you can put in more of those anti-inflammatory fats, whether it's blending up an avocado, adding, more nuts and seeds can be a really nice vehicle just to getting in more of those calories.
And what is your thought on like MCT oil, medium chain triglyceride oils?
Yeah, those are really, really popular right now. For some people, they can be a game changer. For others, I don't find them as useful. And obviously, the MCTs, they are technically a saturated fat. So just wanting to make sure we're not overusing those, especially if someone also has a higher risk of heart disease or we're trying to manage just more inflammatory type situation. Exactly. Yeah. Cholesterol too, it can be part of that. I mean, we know there's mixed research around the optimal levels of cholesterol and what exactly that risk is being correlated with. But overall, I think we still want to be mindful of just keeping things in balance. So I wouldn't recommend that people go overboard with the MCT oils, but I think they can be used therapeutically really nice in small amounts. But again, always doing that experiment, of seeing, when we add this in, like for some of my elderly patients, it can be just a great way to get in extra calories just because it's so energy dense in that regard. But for other people, we see it doesn't move the dial as much. Their body isn't as efficient as then convert. Well, one of the reasons the MCT oils are so popular, the research and marketing really likes to claim that they are going to be a readily available fuel source for the brain. And also a readily available fuel source for ketone production so that they can easily be converted into ketones. I don't see that across the board in all my patients though. So not to be a buzzkill, but it's not a panacea. So like with anything else, of just really kind of taking a scientific approach about it, doing kind of establishing that baseline maybe before you start using that product. And obviously choosing really high quality organic sources, ideally that are in glass bottles, not plastic. Because again, a lot of those endocrine disruptors, they're all fat soluble. So, that can really leach a lot out of that bottle. I can't
in plastics.
When they're in plastics. Yeah. Yep. So, to varying degree, whether or not it's an amber colored plastic or type of plastic, even if it's BPA free, we do know that there's still just a lot of not as well researched compounds that are in plastics nowadays that we just really need to be careful of. So I bring that up just because, again, that toxicity, the endocrine disruptors just causing such rampant inflammation in the brain. And we tend to see higher rates of toxicity infections, inflammation, again, as a hallmark of this disease. So imagine your brain, when you're experiencing cognitive decline and even full-blown Alzheimer's, your brain is just and your body is so much less efficient at processing these things. So it's much harder for your brain to stay on top of that toxic load. So that's another aspect I work with most of my patients on, of just kind of looking through the, the types of foods they're buying, where they're grocery shopping, and just trying to kind of find something that shifts the needle there in terms of quality, whether it's shifting, maybe for them, the next step would be shifting to all glass bottles and things like that, of really trying to get most of the plastic out of their life. It's impossible to do 100% just with how our food system is. But yeah, just trying to kind of take the next step there to try and remove any toxic exposure we can.
When you said kind of get a baseline, how would you recommend measuring both omega-3 or fatty acid levels? How do you recommend measuring ketones?
There's a lot of different ways to measure omega-3s. In the nutrition world, in past, when working with a lot of individuals with neurological disorders, I was either working with a neurologist, neuropsychologist, or an MD or something like that. So obviously had access to very different lab testing at the time, versus now in private practice nutrition, the best option would really be something like a NutriVal test of looking at the omega-3 index. So that's looking at the ratio and then individual levels of those omega-3s.
The NutriEval, just to say, is a test run by a company called Genova Diagnostics, which we also have at Center for Healing Neurology, and you run at Starkle Nutrition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And then as far as measuring ketones, so there's three classic ways that we can measure ketones. The least expensive would probably be through the urine, but it's also the least accurate. So again, and a reminder, when ketones are showing up in the urine, those are excess. They're in excess. So only ketones produced in excess are going to really show up in the urine. So it's not as accurate, of a marker there. Next would be breath. And another reminder that not all ketones are going to show up in the breath. So there's three different types of ketones that your body produces. Some are more volatile than others. And, you're really only capturing one type of ketone that's showing up in your breath, versus when you measure in the blood, that's going to be far more accurate. It is a little more expensive, just because anyone who's regularly testing their blood sugars knows, you need a fresh lancet, you need a fresh testing strip, and you need a monitor then to be able to use that. But it is by far the most accurate. And for most of my patients, the goal is not for them to be in ketosis permanently. They might be in it for a period of max 8 to 12 weeks to really get that benefit, to really have those alterations on the metabolism. And then the goals are much different from then on out. They probably will always be following somewhat of a lower carbohydrate, or rather a less carbohydrate centric pattern of eating. But the goals are then no longer kind of to hit specific ranges with the ketones. Yeah. So blood by far the most accurate.
The urine is urine strips, correct? I think you can buy them on Amazon.
Definitely, yeah. So they just work like litmus paper, essentially. They're looking at the parts per million and concentration in your urine. So that when you can either hold them in the stream of your urine or pee into a cup and then dip them, it's basically just changing color based on the concentration that it picks up in the urine of ketones.
If people are checking either via urine or blood or breath, I guess, is there like a schedule for checking that you recommend?
Yeah, so glad you asked that, because everyone's body is so different. Classically, when first starting a protocol, I will be super annoying and ask my patients to measure 3 times a day. So usually first thing in the morning when they're fasting, and then an hour after that, so an hour after they eat, to sort of measure that ketone response, and then usually an hour before bed. So usually I have typical ranges where I'm recommending people are kind of eating throughout the day, depending on what they have going on, so that sort of fits their schedule a little bit. So ideally, they're not eating generally 2 to 3 hours before bed, so that evening time will be representative, also kind of that response after the meal. And for some people, we might include an afternoon one as well. So for some people, their ketone production is highest in the afternoon, not everyone. So just trying to kind of get a good picture of kind of what their response is throughout the day. And that's going to vary from day to day, from meal to meal, depending on, again, their activity level, their stress level. Just like with blood sugar, right? We know all those things are impact blood sugar, so they also will impact ketone production. So just to, again, get a good picture of what that's like for them. So if I'm typically seeing really low fasting numbers, looking at what's happening the night before, looking at the quality of their sleep, what meal did they have the night before, how are they feeling when they wake up, just sort of digging a little more there, versus, if it's after their morning meal, looking at what is their morning meal like? What are their mornings like for them? Are they working out? Are they less active? And then same with that evening meal, of sort of looking at what's been happening throughout the day. What was lunch like for them? What was dinner like for them? To kind of help tweak some of those parameters to help improve those numbers.
Can you talk about the three different types of ketones? Like, what is a ketone?
Yeah, so a ketone body is basically, it's a byproduct fat metabolism. So essentially when we're metabolizing those fats for fuel, the body produces a ketone body. That ketone body can then cross the blood-brain barrier, be transferred up to the brain for fuel. And so glucose is the preferred fuel, and it's sort of the default mode for our cells and for our metabolism. Typically, we have a readily available source of carbohydrates coming in all the time. So our body typically doesn't have to go into ketosis. And it can be a form of metabolism that many bodies out there fight and don't want to get into, because it's not as efficient, in that sense. It takes a lot of energy to then produce those ketones. It's sort of it's a more circumvented metabolic pathway, we could even think of it as.
And what are the benefits of being in ketosis?
So some of the benefits, of ketosis is that, you're no longer dependent on that consistent fuel of carbohydrates coming in. A lot of the proponents of ketosis are then saying that, you can then use your body's stores. Essentially, if we think about the ability that our body has to store carbohydrates, that's really limited. And that it does depend on the health of our mitochondria and things like that, as how efficient we are in terms of our glycogen stores. But we're going to run out of glycogen in that overnight fasting time. For most people, that 12-hour fast can be, depending again on the constituents and makeup of their evening meal, they're going to burn through all of their readily available carbohydrates during that time. So especially if they've been following a lower carb plan this entire time. And again, sleeping doesn't take much energy. So imagine if you're active, that's going to be a couple hours you burn through your glycogen stores, especially for a high level of activity. So that right there in the example, you can see the advantage of ketones. We can store, so many pounds of fat fuel on our body. So it's sort of what we could almost think of it as an unlimited fuel supply, especially for events, like athletic events and things like that it's something that our body always has access to. But, some people's bodies are better than others at tapping into that, and some people still will need to take in a minimal amount of carbohydrates to be able to sort of nudge the body a little bit to sort of tap into that. But one of the biggest advantages is not having the body, again, go through that huge rise and then extreme fall. So it sort of keeps you more on a little bit of an even keel, depending on how sensitive the body is and how well adapted it is to kind of utilizing ketosis as a fuel source. We tend to see with that, better hormonal regulation, because then cortisol doesn't have to step in all the time and help regulate that rise and fall of blood sugars. And also we tend to see better mood, better mental acuity, because again, that fuel source can easily travel to the brain to sort of meet all the brain's needs, whether that's improving cognition, improving energy and alertness, or even just feeding the brain cells for regeneration and for repair.
Why would we not want to be in ketosis all the time? Okay, so it's a little inefficient, but sounds great. Why not stay there?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, with the fasting, because ketosis, essentially you're mimicking fasting. That's why the diet works in epileptic children. But with that, it is still something that's temporary. And oftentimes, only until very recently has even ketogenic diets come back into the play for children. There are better medications, obviously, nowadays than when I read that article all the way back in adolescence. That just have fewer side effects. So, there can be some negative side effects of the ketogenic diet. So it tends to be very dehydrating, hence why we get that initial weight loss effect in a lot of individuals who may initially switch to that ketogenic eating profile. I think of it as a natural diuretic in terms of kind of just expelling a lot of water from our cells and our body in general. For some individuals, can have big impacts on the gut microbiome. So if we think about what a drastic shift in dietary patterns it is for most people, and also you've cut out a major food group, right? You're not as reliant on carbohydrates anymore. So we do know that many carbohydrate-rich foods are really helpful for our health. So, that's where we get the majority of our fiber. So really supplying the cells of our microbiome and giving them fuel. That way they can help us out and do all of their really important jobs for us. They contribute to metabolism too. They're going to help us with producing immune factors, producing and synthesizing different vitamins and nutrients, as well as with hormone metabolism. So really trying to balance those two goals of, still trying to include fiber, include a nice wealth of micronutrients and minerals and antioxidants can be just a little more difficult, when you're on a more restrictive diet. So you're naturally not getting that same variety. And variety, in my world is key. You want lots of different colors, lots of different textures, lots of different plant products. All plant products come with carbs. So there's going to be some carbs there. And also, you're not consuming legumes and beans. And obviously, some people are eating grain-free, some people are eating low lectin, whatever their dietary goals are for whatever reasons, we want to take all of that into account. But for those that maybe aren't following specific dietary patterns, or they choose to be avoiding some of those things, like the beans and the grains, they still can be very healthful foods for many individuals. So again, the biggest downside is just that you're not able to eat as much variety. So you're not taking in as much nutrition.
Should ketosis be cycled? Like now there's kind of more and more conversation around keto cycling in terms of getting the benefits of being in ketosis, but not hanging out there.
Yeah, that tends to be a very popular way of thinking about it. And it also tends to make it much more sustainable for people. Mm-hmm. And I see some athletes doing this as well. So really cycling ketogenic diets around their training schedule, around their performance schedule. It's very hard to be actively training and getting ready for an event while you're going through a hardcore ketogenic diet. And, there's various reasons behind that we don't have to get into today because it's not as applicable to conversation. But for those looking more into cognitive health, I find that it can just be much more sustainable. And I think of that as, again, that is one an example of maybe a healthy stressor that my population can easily manage, that kind of getting in and out of ketosis, kind of cycling on and cycling off, because it gives you kind of the benefits of both worlds in that sense. They're not restricted 100% of the time. They can still have variety when they're not following a ketogenic diet. And obviously they're not cycling from a ketogenic diet to a standard American diet. We still want to really focus on anti-inflammatory elements. So maybe on those non-ketogenic days, they're eating lots of resistant starch. So that's going to be a compound found in, for instance, even white potatoes. When they're cooked and cooled, those carbohydrates are going to reorganize in a way that they're going to digest much slower, easiest way to put it. So they're not going to have, again, that same extreme rise and then fall in our blood sugars. And they're supplying amazing benefits to our gut microbiome. That can be one way of really choosing, when you do choose to include carbohydrate foods, just being really selective and particular about what types of foods you're including.
Am I hearing you say, bring back the potato salad? The cold potato salad.
Yeah, you just prep it in advance. You cook it, you cool it, and you eat it the next day. Yeah. So that could be white potatoes. That could be sweet potatoes. Ideally leaving the skin on to get even more antioxidant benefit and more fiber. But all kinds of potatoes, if cooked appropriately and prepared appropriately, can be really nutritious foods.
We just have a few minutes left. So let's dive into what is the deal with chocolate? Why are we so obsessed? Talk to us about chocolate.
Yeah. Part of my thesis was looking at the mineral content. And so in my long classroom days in grad school, I always had chocolate, out in front of me as I was furiously taking notes. And of course, as any nutrition student would do, I read nutrition labels. And one day I looked at the label and noticed astronomically high values for things like iron and magnesium. So for people who don't know the recommended daily nutrient numbers by heart, like I do, an ounce of chocolate has about just over 15 to 16% of your daily needs for magnesium. So I like to think that it's the nutrient density. So looking specifically at those micronutrients and minerals that really make chocolate such an appealing food. And, when we look at cacao powder as compared to cocoa powder, we know that cacao, being a little less processed, tends to have even more minerals and micronutrients in it as compared to like a refined cocoa product. Both are really beneficial, don't get me wrong. So if you're using one versus the other in your brownies, no judgment.
What is the difference? What is the processing that makes cocoa out of cacao?
So cocoa tends to be more treated to be more alkaline. And so it's a little more predictive in how it's going to respond in the baking process. So I also minored in food science in undergrad. And so this is a way I could nerd out for hours. And obviously, as you mentioned, I love to cook. So it just works a little more predictably, since acids and bases and neutral food element going to just affect, the baking qualities of that, whether it be color, texture, the rise, the loft, and just how all those ingredients intermingle and respond. So the cacao, being a little more processed, it has some of the minerals removed from it, like any processed refined product would. The color, you might notice, differs a little bit. Cacao tends to be a little bit lighter, more brighter, but it also can be a little bit more bitter and more astringent, which is a hallmark across any unsweetened chocolate product, but even more so really in that unrefined cacao. And that's usually the mineral content. And also just because the acidity hasn't been neutralized quite as much as it has been in cacao products. So really it just comes down to processing, how they're processed. The cacao is going to have more minerals. But with that, like any unprocessed product, it's not going to behave quite as predictably, when we're using it to cook with.
What are the materials that are used to process? Is this like potassium sorbate, or is this what chemical is used to process?
I've been out of the food processing world for quite a long time. So I'd have to, and part of my thesis, I literally had to contact chocolate companies, asking them, what methods they use for processing, what methods, because that's going to impact mineral content, as we just acknowledged, and also what processes they use to analyze it, because chocolate is such a fatty product that it doesn't work very well in bomb calorimetry. It doesn't work really well in just heating it up, because you get left with this very waxy substance where there's still a lot of nutrients and minerals in there. So oftentimes you do have to treat it with a lot of highly chemical compounds to get it to behave and break down properly, and just to be able to analyze it, let alone produce a food product out of it. So that's just trying to accurately assess, what the content is. So, I had so many fun conversations with the USDA, calling them and trying to talk to Hershey's and all the different chocolate companies out there. And all of it can be summed up with every single producer has their own proprietary method, which no one wanted to talk to me about. I felt like an investigative journalist trying to contact these companies and ask for more information. So Hershey's, above all, did not want to give me the time of day, did not want to talk. So if you're a fan of Hershey's out there, that's fine. But no, they did not want to talk to a lowly grad student as far as understanding their methods of processing.
Wow. Why do we crave so much chocolate?
Women especially are a group that crave chocolate more than most others out there. So many of the theories out there, again, come down to nutrient content. So with that high magnesium content, we knew that magnesium is involved in so much hormone metabolism, like estrogen metabolism is a big part of magnesium's role. I mean, it's also involved in brain health and muscle contraction and so many other aspects of metabolism and things like that. But we also know it's a huge smooth muscle relaxant. So something during our PMS time of the month, smooth muscle relaxants can really help with cramping, breast tenderness. We tend to see magnesium deficiency more associated with things like fibroids, so they definitely have a strong connection there in terms of, one thought is that if we're magnesium deficient, that's why we're craving that chocolate. And it's not uncommon for many women, if they get their levels checked at different points in their cycle, you do tend to see that magnesium can go down right before someone's cycle. Again, that depends on how someone's eating. Typically right before our cycle, we are craving foods that are not as nutrient dense. So that could be part of it too. It doesn't necessarily have to be determined by our hormonal cycle, but we want to take into all those factors when making recommendations. So I think it really just comes down to the fact that it's such a nutrient dense product. So, not only is it calorically dense with the cacao fats and things like that, but it's so mineral dense, given that it comes from, it's literally this fermented seed, comes from the earth. And we know it was used a lot traditionally in Aztec and Mayan cultures as like the food of the gods, and was given to high level athletes before going out to their events. It was given to soldiers before they went off to battle. So it's definitely been lauded and praised in so many different cultures, not just among us ladies.
Well, any final thoughts about anything you want to share?
We covered a big gamut, but I didn't get to share some of my favorite foods or rather ways to, like, recipes and things like that to cook for brain health. So I think it's delicious. It's a recipe that I've adapted for our listeners here in Seattle area. We have a great co-op, PCC Markets. They have a wonderful recipe bank online for folks. So for those that aren't local, their roasted tahini and cauliflower dish is one of my absolute favorites. I would make that a lot in the teaching kitchen just because it's a simple recipe, but you have so many heavy hitters in terms of nutrient density. So you have the tahini, it's in a tahini sauce. So that's a sesame paste. So again, really rich in unsaturated fatty acids for that. So you're getting a really high concentration of fat. You're also getting, usually there's roasted onions with that, and then also roasted cauliflower with that too. So we didn't talk about the benefit of cruciferous vegetables as far as it goes to brain health and detoxification and just supporting your body's own antioxidant production. So you're getting both the allium family with the onions and the cruciferous family for the cauliflower. It's mostly the fact that those are both really strong sulfur donors. They're helping to produce your body's natural source of glutathione, which again helps with detoxification and antioxidant production in the body. So really, I think that is one of the most ideal dishes and ways to really get some of those key nutrients in. There's other options if you don't like cauliflower, but more on that another time.
Oh, that sounds delicious. Oh gosh. Well, thank you so much for being here. This has been fantastic. And we've learned a ton. And, already my mind is turning about, we should have you back and do like a whole podcast of recipes.
I have a huge passion for this. Obviously the dementia and cognitive health, it's just a population that's so vulnerable and, needs support. And there's so little information out there, reputable information, especially, and just as far as direction and treatment options go, as you well know, Jillian, working really closely with this population as well, just being a support service for them is just, it's so rewarding, working with these families.
And people can reach you online, is that correct?
Yeah. So especially right now, during the time of Corona, we are 100% telehealth. So we will likely always offer telehealth for those options. So for cash pay, that can be anyone in the world. For insurance reasons, you need to be local in Washington State. But we do take most major insurance companies. You would find us at starklenutrition.com. There's actually 8 different practitioners I work with there at the practice who all have their own specialty. And so you can find me on that website under the About Us and Nutritionist page. And you can actually there's a contact page on there as well if you want to schedule or just reach out with questions.
And you also are managing the metabolic reset, which we did not get to cardiovascular focus today, but the metreset.com is another place folks can find you.
Another one of my passions is more that intuitive eating, mindful eating piece of really working on that relationship with food. So working with individuals who've just been, chronically dieting their entire life and really just addressing some of the underlying health conditions and health concerns that can be there. Also extremely rewarding and area for me and a huge passion of mine as well.
Well, we are so lucky to have you here with us today, and your experience, what you know in the world, is just phenomenal. So thank you for sharing it with us.
Oh, thank you so much, Jillian. It was such a pleasure to be here.
So thank you for listening here today with Riana Giusti. We've got lots of ways to continue this conversation through Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can get more information from and about us on our website, centerforhealingneurology.com, and more information about Riana at starklenutrition.com or metreset.com. Please be sure to share this show with your friends, and we welcome your rating and reviews wherever you get your podcasts, and feel free to send topic requests to podcast@centerforhealingneurology.com. We love that you've joined us today to discuss how to make our whole world medicine. We rise or fall together, and we are committed to doing what we can to make as many of us as healthy as possible. And this takes all of us, including you. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.
Fish Media. Party Fish Media acknowledges that it operates and records on indigenous Duwamish and Puget Sound Coast Salish land that is still home to the Duwamish tribe. This land is stolen in violation of the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. We are committed to uplifting the name of these lands and community members from these nations who reside alongside us. For more information on this land, its people, or ways you can help, visit duwamishtribe.org or realrentduwamish.org.